Hi everyone, I'm Jocelyn, and I am grateful you're here. You're listening to the Starting with Gratitude podcast. This is a safe space intended to host meaningful conversations exploring all topics of the human experience. Every conversation starts with gratitude and remains rooted in gratitude. After you listen, make sure to join the community by subscribing and sharing. I am so happy you have joined us. Hello, Witchdoctoralex.
Hello.
How is your spirit doing in this moment?
My spirit is wonderful. It's receptive. It's in gratitude. Funny enough, and I'm at a really positive place. I was even telling my brother last night how good of a place I am mentally and spiritually since I've moved recently. So I'm in a wonderful place.
I was about to ask you, what do you feel contributed to your overall wellness? Do you think it was mainly the move?
Well, to a degree, yeah. I mean, for the most part, I would say probably like 60% of it was the move, only because, there's this thing in astrology called astrocartography, and I'm particularly I partake in astrology as well as my other endeavors. But in astrocartography, when at the time of our birth, we have these planetary lines that cross us. So right now here in Dallas is where I have my Venus line, and I have Venus in its home of Libra. Long story short, lots of positive things are attracting themselves to me, and I'm attracting myself to them as well. So it's very much kind of a good connection in tandem. Business is positive as well. I wasn't having this experience when I was living in Los Angeles, and there my planetary lines are Mars and Mercury. So I was constantly on the go, constantly in survival mode, and now I don't necessarily have that issue, luckily enough. And on top of it, my mother's healthy. I'm closer to my mom, so it gives me a lot more peace of mind, as well as my father as well. He's a little farther, but I'm closer to my family, so I have that peace of mind knowing that, anything were to ever happen, I could get to them in a matter of time. So I definitely have that peace. So definitely the move is, I would say, 60% of my well-being right now. Yeah.
I love that. I feel like perhaps a lot of people underestimate how important your environment is, like where it is
Absolutely.
that you live. Like you could be born and raised somewhere that actually isn't really meant for you and your
Yeah,
spiritual growth.
that's the truth. Yeah.
And I feel like I really awakened to that when I started traveling outside of where I grew up, which was like
Hmm.
a very, very small town, a very small border town. And I think I've been reflecting on this a lot, actually, because this is my second year living in LA.
Hmm.
And I don't know, just like with the recent spiritual awakening that I had, I feel like I'm now realizing that your environmental needs will also change as you change.
Yes, very true.
So I'm glad that we touched on that. We're going to touch on more, but
Yeah,
before we
yeah,
dive in,
yeah.
I'm going to ask you to share with us your expression of gratitude.
Absolutely. So what I have is kind of similar to what I was saying. I don't know if you can still see me, but it was similar to what I was saying in regards to my parents. I said, I am most grateful for the health and well-being of my parents. They have been through so much health and living situation-wise, and I often think about the many times in my youth I lived in fear of their early demise and what my life would be like. Luckily, God and the ancestors have blessed me, and then with many years together, them with many years together, excuse me. I'm also grateful for the growth I have acquired in terms of my finances, another fear mindset I have outlived. I was someone who lived with friends, parents of friends, and in cars. I no longer have that issue thanks to the gifts God has endowed me with through my many supporters.
That's beautiful.
Yeah,
Thank you for
thank
sharing
you.
all of that. Why do you feel like at this time family is such a big theme for you?
Um, because I'm getting older, um, And because of the pandemic, it really put, a lot of people to their limits, pushed people to their limits in terms of mortality as well as resources. And, in times like that, it's definitely best to have those that are closest to you, or at least people that you can trust if you have a positive relationship with them, people that you can trust and that you're closest to you in those times. So, that definitely put things into perspective on top of, my age and where I'm headed and the things that I want to do and, the things that I've experienced as well,
Yeah, yeah. What season of life would you say that you're currently in right now?
Good question. I would say right at the end of winter, right before spring. I definitely feel like I'm on the brink of even more growth. I'm not at summer, that's for sure. But I would definitely say like probably like late March. So yeah, definitely the end of winter, right at the brink of spring, that's for sure.
What what does winter, or I guess like what do the seasons signify for to you?
So yeah, absolutely. So with fall, I would say that's more so kind of the death of the old and preparing for transformation. Winter is transformation and incubation, definitely kind of preserving energies and more so reflection. Spring is growth and potential and more so kind of forecasting for the future. And for summer is ultimately when things become full bloom and more so kind of identity is under the spotlight or more so kind of under the magnifying glass, I'll say. And there's definitely time for harvest as well during summer, but for the most part I would say definitely when things are in full bloom or summertime, things get to show themselves.
Yeah. Since you feel like you're transitioning into spring at this
Mm-hmm.
time, what do you forecast for yourself?
I would say I forecast for myself things involving career, things involving stability, that's for sure. I don't know if you are aware of this, but in the fall, I lost my Instagram page, which was more so kind of the main resource for my clients, for my platform and whatnot. I lost that page for whatever reason, but it the interesting thing about it is it pushed me towards TikTok. And with TikTok, it's like you have to show your face, you have to kind of learn new skills in regards to editing and more so kind of speaking on camera. So like, I lost one thing. I was in this process of loss, but through this winter phase that I'm in, I'm going through this incubation, I'm going through this transformation that ultimately allows me to get towards the spring, as I said, and eventually the summer, I said, in terms of presenting myself, in terms of making my identity more front and center. So yeah, that's definitely how I feel about it.
Yeah, yeah. I did notice that you didn't have an Instagram page when I
Yeah,
was like
yeah.
looking you up. Yeah, it's so interesting how like certain endings that you feel are could be like the root of your demise or like
Mm-hmm.
could like really mess things up for you are actually, if you really shift your perspective, provide you an opportunity to like redirect yourself in a direction
Absolutely.
where there's potential for a lot of growth. So I'm glad that you shifted your perspective in that way.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because before I lost that Instagram page, like I would find myself kind of dreading it. Even, I mean, I know it sounds like very, silly and very kind of shallow or whatever, but it's just like, having to come up with content and keep people engaged, especially on like, an app that you kind of have to fight for to get in the algorithm ultimately. And then there's all this kind of nonsense in terms of the community, so to speak, that's super political. And like, I found myself dreading it. And I feel like the universe heard my qualms, my issues out loud, even though I was saying them to myself subconsciously. I feel like it heard them out loud and it opened a window, closed the door, opened a window. And it's like, okay, here, we'll give you this. We'll give you a brand new platform to find yourself, to do what it is that you do and reach a new audience and ultimately express yourself in a way that you couldn't and wouldn't normally. So absolutely, definitely changing perspective.
Yeah. If I'm not mistaken, like you have been in this spiritual space,
Yeah,
comfortably and openly and vulnerably for a while now.
yeah, yeah.
Have you yourself noticed the um like just more and more spiritualists, I guess, like kind of coming to the surface, and these topics becoming more comfortable for people to like be discussing?
Yes, yes, absolutely. I would say so. There's definitely some astrological reasons as to why, there's the Pluto and Sagittarius generation, people who were born after 1995. And in between, like I want to say 2008, yeah, 1995 and 2008, people that were born in between those particular times, they're definitely highly spiritual, as well as, us being in Neptune and Pisces. But aside from the astrology, I would say, it's there's a lot more transparency in terms of how detrimental the powers that be are, whether you attribute that to the world government or the environment, how the environment has impacted us. Ultimately, it's definitely made people a lot more receptive to the things that are in our control and things that aren't in our control ultimately. And it's allowed for people to really find something that's definitely outside of themselves, that isn't what they're ultimately kind of taught or very much kind of indoctrinated with the church or Catholicism or Judaism or whatever it is that you attribute normal or more so kind of regular spirituality to. It's definitely called for many of us, a lot of us, especially those of us in the spiritual community, to find something that more so kind of resonates with something that's more realistic based off of what we see and what we deal with on a daily basis. And depending on what it is that you're into, what works is what works ultimately. So yeah, I definitely feel like, there's multiple reasons or explanations, I'll say, as to why there's such this plethora of new spiritualists, or more so kind of people finding themselves in spirituality.
Yeah. What about when it comes to like spiritual warfare?
Hmm.
What are your thoughts on that?
People have to protect themselves. I mean, even if you aren't spiritual, it's super important to protect yourself, especially in this day and age. I mean, like, you see what's going on in the Middle East right now, that spiritual warfare. You see what's going on in even on the internet with big business and small business, that's spiritual warfare. Or even with the economy, that's all spiritual warfare. Protection is super important. Cleansing oneself is super important. Autonomy and authority over oneself, as well as maintaining a level of secrecy, is super important in regards to not being vulnerable to a degree in terms of people you trust, but not being vulnerable to the point to where it's like anyone can have access to your your aura, your spiritual self ultimately. So I feel like in regards to spiritual warfare, protection and cleansing is super important. I always tell my clients that. In terms of what I see, I feel like we're just at the opening, or more so kind of the opening ceremony of what's to come. I don't feel like it will get like violent to how it's been in the past, but I do feel like it'll get like more so kind of dangerous in a different way, to where it's like it isn't so much kind of like on a battlefield or anything like that, like warfare in regards to that, but more so kind of mentally and spiritually, in terms of the sense to where it's like people's thought process. They have this thing called cancel culture now, and that's a form of spiritual warfare. I feel like that's where things will kind of are, well, things are going ultimately, as opposed to kind of, missiles and guns and whatnot that,
Mm,
definitely have a spiritual equate, that definitely equate spiritually, at least.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, cancel culture is very interesting. I
Hmm.
think maybe perhaps, there was good intention somewhere
Absolutely.
in the, root of it,
Hmm.
but I do feel like it's incredibly important for us to be mindful of allowing people to learn from their mistakes.
Absolutely.
And um,
Redemption
exactly,
and rehabilitation. Absolutely.
exactly. Yeah. Like, I think that it's more important for us to be more focused on community
Hmm.
rather than the harshness that can come with just canceling someone.
Absolutely.
And also, like, just kind of touching back on like the rise of, spiritualists and people kind of stepping into their gifts and becoming more comfortable with these topics. You know, I don't, everyone's timeline looks different,
Yeah,
but, you know, getting on Twitter, for example, and seeing all these channeled messages for the collective, I think for those that are just now kind of stepping into this space, it's really important to be mindful to not be absorbing every collective
absolutely.
message that you see, because that in itself can really influence you in a way that's like not meant for you.
Yeah.
Talking about, you know, stepping into this space, I'm really curious about how you stepped into this space. Like, were you raised and you saw spiritual practice, you know,
Hmm.
in the household? How was that experience for you?
So, and I tell this story often, and it's funny because I was just even talking about this to a friend, and it's how I started is more so kind of I noticed that, how my mother's side of the family was very different in terms of spiritualism, in terms of religion. They were very different from my father's side of the family. My mother's side is from Louisiana, and I always noticed that, my great grandmother, she did things that, my father's side didn't necessarily do. And then come to find out, cut to 2013, I was going through like, all this crazy stuff mentally, mm, like suicide stuff and mental health stuff and stuff. And so like the environment that I had, the people that I had around me weren't necessarily kind of the most beneficial. But at that time in 2013, I had met a medium and a psychic medium. And so he was telling me all these things about my family that I always had suspicions about, but I never necessarily kind of voiced. And for him to know those things without me even really knowing him, definitely opened up kind of a part of my brain. And then one thing led to another. My mother retired. She and her husband retired, moved back to Louisiana. And I started really discovering my roots, discovering my ancestry, discovering, what gifts I potentially have. And, how that led into all of this is, I started doing certain things with an ex of mine and they started to work. And so, like, my process definitely progressed and developed, and things just definitely took off from there. That's the short summarized part of it. But with that, it's more so kind of a lot of transformation. We call it a tower moment in the spiritual community, and that's definitely what I went through in 2013. Because I lost my car, I had no money, and I didn't have any real friends around me. I considered them friends only because they were inconvenience to me and to them. I was super inconvenienced to them. But now I know the difference, and now I understand why these particular cycles happen in our life. But that's more so kind of like I said, the summarized version as to how I got into all of this. 2016 came around, and it was the super full moon in November, right after the election. And I started that particular account, Witchdoctoralex, ultimately. And things took off after another. It was conjunct my North Node astrologically. Um, and things took off after that. And I, luckily, and the nice thing about it is I was able to gain community based off of, this part of myself that I was finding, because many other people were finding themselves at the same time as well. Um, and that's, like I said, the summarized version of how I got started.
Yeah. What were like the first divination tools that like you, you know, started using when you first stepped into this space?
Honestly, I didn't pick up tarot until like late 2017, 2018, but that's mostly what I'm known for now. But I would say mostly I was into astrology first, as far as like divining to a degree. And then everything happened after that. But it was mostly just astrology and tarot. I don't know, looking now that I think about it, now that I say that out loud, it's kind of like, I should be a lot more varied by now. But I'm not in competition with anyone ultimately. But yeah, I would say mostly just astrology and then eventually tarot. 2017, 2018.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like I barely really got into I've always been aware of my spirituality, my spirit, source, and like just having spiritual gifts and stuff. But I last year was really the year where I almost felt like I was forced into really stepping into them and claiming them. And
Mm-hmm.
or when I got into like, using oracle cards and stuff, it just felt like I experienced this like rapid growth of all these tools in spirituality that you can use. I started feeling like overwhelmed,
Mm-hmm.
like, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
there's astrology, there's tarot, there's uh you know so many,
Mm-hmm.
many divination tools. So I bring that up because you mentioned, like you feel like you should, be more expanded
Yeah,
at some,
experience.
but
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
but
Not everything works for everyone at the same time too. So it's kind of like, that's the double-edged sword with it as well. So
exactly. And I think that what's most, in my opinion, important is to really begin with your roots, to begin
absolutely.
with your what your ancestors practiced with,
Yeah.
what I don't know, because I just feel like that's what comes naturally to you
Mm-hmm.
and is already embedded in you, is like whatever it is that like your ancestors would use. And um yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a big part of what my practice is now, what we call hoodoo in the Black community. It's definitely ancestor and veneration, as well as kind of incorporating customs and so where I'm looking for. We'll just say customs that, the community or my community more so kind of has always had and has incorporated from slavery and even pre-slavery, and more so kind of have enveloped into now. Definitely that.
Yeah, yeah. For those that, aren't really fully aware of like what a tower moment really encompasses,
Mhm.
what does that look like?
I would say for the most part, it can come across as unexpected. Most of the time, it can come across as super inconvenient. I'll say that, for some people, it may kind of, let's say, for example, you're, social media influencer, it could be something that you get, canceled over, and then you lose all your endorsements or all your followers or whatever the case may be. Or it could be, whether you are a preacher and, it gets revealed that you are involved in, I don't know, a sex scandal, and then you lose your flock or something like that. But it doesn't always necessarily equate to you losing other people. It could equate to you losing yourself. For me, example, like I said, in 2013, I lost my car. I didn't have any real friends of mine. I was in the hospital. No one called me. No one visited me. But yet, I had people living with me. I would pay for them to do this. I would pay for them to do that. And it's more so kind of a loss of perspective, more so kind of a wake up call in regards to what we really need to more so kind of focus on, that we weren't focusing on, that if we left it up to ourselves, we wouldn't do anything about. It's more so kind of a chapter reset ultimately, to where it's like the universe does it for you because you're too nice, or you're too complacent, or you too, too deep in procrastination of making change. So ultimately, it's kind of like, the hand of God just strikes down and does all these things, washes all these things away, so you can get better perspective on what's really going on with you. And then ultimately, it's a situation to where you're able to look back at it and ultimately be grateful and thankful that it happened, that you were able to have that experience. It comes along with age and wisdom and experience. Is ultimately the final destination of a tower moment. But ultimately, when you're going through it, it's definitely uncomfortable, definitely doesn't feel good, definitely isn't fun, but it's super necessary in regards to ending chapters and growth and potential ultimately.
Yeah, and I think that's partly the reason why it's so important for us to be so accepting of change,
Mm-hmm.
because it's inevitable, it's going to happen regardless. And as you mentioned and touched on, it's like if you are so resistant of change, of
Mm-hmm.
necessary changes, you're really only creating more and more friction, to the point where change is going to happen. It's going to come to you. It's going to
Yeah.
feel forced.
Mm-hmm.
And it's going to feel very drastic. But I feel like that's only because you had resisted something for so long, and you had steered your way, away from your divine path. I definitely went through a tower moment around the same time, actually, but I was still so resistant to the change that I feel like my tower moment lasted like a couple years.
Mine did too. Yeah.
And like it really is like a matter of time for you to like transition out of it to really actually be able to look back and see, okay, this was meant to be. I'm so grateful for this experience. But like while you're in it, it is
Trust me, I know. Yeah. Yeah.
wow.
Yeah.
But now that we're years ahead of that moment, I definitely, like, for me, I honestly see it as like my rock bottom.
Mm.
And I'm personally grateful that I have experienced that rock bottom, because now whenever it is that I'm going through things or, just find myself in like difficult situations, I partly look back at that moment and I'm just like,
At least I'm not there. At least I'm
at
not
least
learning that serious situation again. Yeah.
exactly. Do you feel like we can have more than one tower moment?
Absolutely. I definitely know more are on the way. Absolutely. Yeah. And it coincides with going back to astrology and coincides with Saturn returns. Saturn is the great teacher, the taker of time, the tester of time, the taskmaster as they call it. And I was going through my Saturn return at that particular time. And whether even if you don't even subscribe to astrology, ultimately, and astrology isn't so much kind of the reason why things happen, it's more so kind of a reflection of things happening ultimately. Just to clear that up, just to make sure I say that. But on top of that, I definitely feel like we have more than one tower moment, only because it's like, anything that isn't growing is dead. And like the seasons, like crops, like like plants and flowers and stuff like that, they go through a season when they die, and that's their tower moment, even though it isn't necessarily the most unexpected, but ultimately they can anticipate that there will be a time to when they are dead, and there's a time to when they grow back ultimately. And that's definitely a part of the human experience of living and dying and rebirth and all that. So yeah, absolutely, there's definitely more than one tower moment.
Yeah, yeah. I feel like when you notice the own cycles that occur in your life, because I feel like we all have our own personal cycles that we go through, and there is like a pattern that you can take note of. For
Hmm.
example, for myself, I've noticed that I kind of go through an awakening annually,
Hmm.
and it's towards the end of the summer, around like end of July, sometime in August, where I go through like some really drastic change just before um, Scorpio season, which is my season. And now that I know that, I'm able to navigate my cycles in a more prepared, quote unquote, way.
Mm.
Have you noticed these cycles within your own life?
Um, let's say, would I say that there are a particular part of the year? No, not necessarily, but I would say that there are certain times that I can anticipate, or more so kind of looking back, that, their explanations as to why I went through certain things. It's funny because, going back to astrology, we were talking about synodic cycles in astrology and how like 10 years ago, Jupiter was in Pisces, Jupiter is in Pisces now. And I was thinking about kind of how I was working at this job at Children's Hospital, Los Angeles. And it was super awkward, like, because as I was going to school for something that was completely unrelated to what I was working for, but it was really great opportunity, it was really positive opportunity. I was definitely seeing increase financially and instability. However, there were somewhat of vulnerable moments. There definitely were sensitive situations, things I wasn't ready for, things that were definitely super inconvenient, but it was new and was ultimately propelling me. So I would definitely say, in terms of the cycles of life, in terms of anticipating and especially looking back, there are times to where I could say that, that there's correlation for sure. just like with your situation. Yeah, absolutely.
What lessons do you feel you learned in your previous cycle that you've most recently transitioned out of?
Self-worth, value, attention to detail, um, reliability for myself, um, doing daily check-ins, gratitude. Interestingly enough, I have this thing that I say every single day that is a part of Hoodoo. Psalm 74, it's the 74th Psalm, it's verses 16 and 17. And it goes, "The day is thine, the night is also thine. Thou hast made the light and the sun. Thou hast set all the borders of the earth. Thou hast made summer and winter." I say that 3 times a day, once a day, every single day. And it's more so kind of my check-in to be like, thank you for the things that I've been through. Thank you for the things that I will eventually go through. And thank you for the position that I'm at currently, ultimately. And I've able to maintain, a good level-headedness, that's for sure. And that's one of the things that I've learned from these past cycles in terms of, matching the energy of the sun and the moon. Ultimately, they come up for us every single day. So it's like I need to at least do something that matches that energy in gratitude of the energy that they give back to me ultimately. And that's, one of the main things. It's more so kind of consistency, checking in, gratitude, that's for sure. And like I said, reliability in terms of myself, and also friendship as well, and more so kind of the importance and the value of friendship and what it really means in terms of relationship and strengthening relationships as well, you know.
Yeah, yeah. I love that. And I love that you answered the question so quickly, because it tells me that you have definitely reflected on it
Quite
and
a bit. Yeah.
have thought about it. And, I tell people all the time, the simple act of reflecting on your own life is something that you should be proud of and take pride
Hmm.
in yourself, because it, at times cannot be easy. And I feel like there's a good amount of people that don't do the necessary self-reflecting. How do you feel about this upcoming retrograde eclipse season that we're stepping into?
Definitely energy to not be played with, not to be lax with it, but it's not energy to necessarily be feared. That's for sure. The Mercury retrograde is in Gemini. It's in its ruler where it likes to be. However, Mercury is a great trickster. And also we have the eclipses that, are ruled by Jupiter as well as Mercury as well. So you definitely have all those kind of taskmasters of belief systems, of skills, of travel, of distance in the mix. And with that, it's more so kind of you have to be really conscious of where your word travels, where your message travels, and more so kind of, as well as where you actually are going, consciousness of where you are going, literally and metaphorically speaking. Definitely, consciousness of all of those things. But again, it isn't something to be feared, especially if you know about it and you understand that it reflects what's going on and isn't so much kind of the reason for what's going on ultimately. It's more so, like I said before, it's a reflection of what's happening, not so much kind of the reason why something is happening.
Yeah, yeah. I feel like a lot of people will automatically just fear a
Hmm.
retrograde
Yeah.
season. But I don't know. I've just been thinking a lot about how um, it really is just about your perspective.
Hmm.
Like even in tower moments where it feels like it's not your like winning season or
Hmm.
your blessed season, I feel like there's a perspective where it actually is, because there's so much opportunity for growth there. There's so much
Hmm.
opportunity to learn there,
Hmm.
um, that ultimately benefits you and your higher self and you stepping
Absolutely.
into that.
Again, nothing to be feared, opportunity to reflect and work on and make better moving
Yeah.
forward.
What do you feel like you're currently reflecting or like overcoming?
Well, I know this retrograde will definitely be um transiting my seventh house, which is my relationship with other people. how other people see me, or more so that partnerships, relationships ultimately. So it's more so kind of checking my messaging with my relationships with others, friends, acquaintances, business partnerships, things of that nature, as well as my living situation. Definitely more so kind of working on that and doing the groundwork for more stability in regards to that I can anticipate with this retrograde. But one thing that I'm definitely going to be doing is definitely staying, at least trying to kind of stay under the radar with the riffraff of social media during this time, and being more reflective and more cognizant of how I ultimately feel and what my platform means to me, as opposed to meeting the demands or also being in competition with other people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Social media is
Heavy.
so, yeah.
Yeah.
And, the fact that we, also our work can be very dependent on it in regards to attracting clients, promoting
Hmm.
our work. But there's also just so much noise there that you
Absolutely.
can get lost if you're not aware of it.
Yeah.
I want to discuss more about hoodoo.
Yeah.
And to be completely honest, I'm not knowledgeable in
Yeah.
that.
That's fine. Yeah.
Um, how, or I guess, what was your experience in stepping into that specifically?
So I would say, and just to start off, what hoodoo is, it is a ancestral practice that has been carried over generationally. It started with the transatlantic slave trade, when the enslaved people were taken from West Africa. They were brought to the Americas, and more specifically, the ones that were brought to the southern states of America, and that could be Texas through Virginia. Ultimately, the slaves that were brought there, or the enslaved that were brought there, were able to keep some of their practices that they carried from Africa. So, like, for example, oftentimes in the Black community, you'll see on New Year's, families will make black eyed peas, collard greens, and cornbread for prosperity for the new year. That's a hoodoo practice, as well as, oftentimes when you see in the Black church, people will randomly quote scriptures ultimately, and that's an incantation. That's saying something, kind of like what I talked about earlier with the Psalm 74. It's an incantation to enact an action, as well as the knowledge of roots and herbs that we've incorporated into our daily practices with what we've learned from our African ancestors. It's those practices, and more so kind of how we practice it now is this more so kind of a way to not destigmatize, more so kind of that's what I'm looking for. Just more so kind of eradicate the Eurocentric teachings that have been instilled in us as people here in America, and more so kind of connect with our self, connect with our lineage. That's for sure. Because with media and Hollywood, I was just having this conversation yesterday with media and Hollywood. They've always told us that voodoo and these kinds of practices where we weren't worshiping, Christian God and Jesus, white Jesus, ultimately, were demonic and devil worship. And, like we talked about earlier, in terms of this new development with spiritual people, it's allowed us to more so kind of see ourselves reflected in practices that have always been within us. So in regards to, what got me into this, and more so kind of my first start practices, is like I said, with my great grandmother. She would come from Louisiana anytime my grandparents, which was her daughter, and her husband, which was my grandparents would get in really bad arguments. My great grandmother would come, and I would notice she would cook all this food, and she would pray in the closets, pray under the bed, and do all these things that, like, looking back, I see what it is now. But, as a baby, I didn't really understand it. But I noticed that it was different from my father's side of the family, which was more so kind of um, conservative, and more so kind of secular, we'll call it. More so kind of plain Jane, regular, like kind of like go to church and go to work every week and that whole thing, as opposed to my mother's side of the family, which was my great grandmother, the praying under the bed, the boiling herbs, the floor washing, all that stuff that I noticed was different from my father's side of the family is what I practice now. And I've noticed the difference in terms of what I've done and what I do and how far it's gotten me in terms of financial stability, in terms of opportunities, like being on this wonderful podcast. Things that have happened by practicing those things have definitely helped me, and it's definitely liberated me as opposed to the humdrum of just going to work and going to church like I normally would had I not found these things. Yeah.
Yeah. I've been reflecting a lot about how, like, my relationship with spirituality and
Hmm.
religion, and how I've had to um, really unlearn everything that I kind of grew up with and
Hmm.
kind of step into this on my own rather than being forced into it,
Absolutely.
as we were as children. Because I remember, you know, I grew up and my family is Catholic.
Hmm.
And I just remember going to the church and and I don't know, something intuitively, instinctively just didn't feel like it was something I wanted to believe in all the way. Um, Not necessarily uh, the core of the beliefs, but the practice of it
Hmm.
is what I didn't really agree with. And, just like the belief that, if you sin, you go to hell, or um, I just always thought of how source or the most high or God, whatever higher power you believe in, whoever's listening and watching, um, I just always thought of that source being very loving in an unconditional way. So when I would hear about, what would happen if you were to sin and stuff like that, I just personally, it didn't resonate with it.
Hmm.
And now that I've come into my own, spiritual practice and really started learning more about like what my ancestors would use and what they believed in, I've noticed that I'm starting to heal that relationship. Like even just
Absolutely.
using the word God, I was
Hmm.
uncomfortable using that word. I would just say like universe most of the time because it felt more fluid, I guess, and not
Absolutely.
directly tied to a religion.
Mhm.
But now I'm seeing the word God as something that can also be more fluid
Absolutely.
personally.
Yeah, absolutely. It sure is. Yeah.
Also, just kind of observing how, I'll go home. When I go visit back home, I'll take, some sage bundles and herbs and stuff that I like to, smudge my family's homes and stuff. And I'll always get some kind of reaction from it.
Yeah.
But I'm very like, I'm doing this with good intention. Just let me be. I'm gonna feel good doing this. But I just find it so interesting how, like, burning sage is something that our ancestors did, and how, seeing how my family will respond to it just really had me thinking about, like, where did we lose our touch?
Absolutely.
Like our that's what I'll, tell my family, like, our ancestors literally did this. Like, they would burn sage, they would do this, do that. And even just noticing some of the little things that, my family does, like my mom, she'll when I've noticed that, I think this is subconscious, when she notices there's tension in the home, she'll offer to boil cinnamon sticks and make some tea.
Nice.
And then, as I've started learning about herbs and stuff, and how actually boiling cinnamon and the aroma of cinnamon actually helps ease tension and stress.
Uplift the
And
mood. Yeah, absolutely.
exactly, I'm like, these little things like do still kind of find their way, but I think the awareness of it, of where it's rooted from, kind of dissipates.
Hmm. Through colonization and through assimilation. that our families our more recent ancestors did based off of media, based off of what was expected of people,
Yeah.
absolutely. But yeah.
How does your, family respond to your practices?
My father, in the 80s, he was kind of this person just because he was the wild child out of his particular group. But then he kind of went back and went off into his own way, and that's a whole other story. But with my mother, like now, she sees like the complete 180 my life has taken in comparison to, when I was living in cars, living at friends' parents' houses, and always constantly asking her to go to Western Union to send me money. Like she sees the difference based off of what I'm doing. So she isn't hard pressed about making me go to church with her or telling me this isn't working or telling me that isn't working. She sees the difference. She sees it, with her own eyes. So that's I feel like, and I know that she sees the difference because she sees the difference. It's why she's so open and she's so, you know, no, I wouldn't say nonchalant, but she's just so open about it. Like I even have a piece of selenite under. I put a like after she had a real bad respiratory infection in September. I put a piece of selenite under her mattress because to cleanse her and stuff like that. I mean, there's more that you can do than that. But since I did that, and I did that since September, and she's even gotten a new bed, and she keeps that selenite under her mattress now. So it's like little things like that to where it's like she sees the difference, she sees it with her own eyes, and she's open to it, and she doesn't feel any kind of negative way about it. She sees the difference, so it's positive, definitely positive.
Yeah, it is beautiful to see, when your loved ones or your family or older generations are
Mm-hmm.
kind of like you notice them opening up, and being more willing to like see your perspective of things. I want to, when people are very open to discussing any kinds of topics, and especially those that are in the spiritual space, I like touching on death because I feel like it's an uncomfortable topic for most. Um, what do you feel, or like, let me start with like, what is your current relationship with death?
Good question, especially recently. Only because, and I was just talking about this with my brother last night because we were talking about traveling and how he was recently went to Hawaii. And I was telling him how I have this insane fear of flying over water, as well as, I've been in this place to where it's like, because of my mother's health, she's great now health wise, but I mean, for as long as I've been alive, I've always been in constant fear of my mother's mortality. So, like, I could, say that, oh, I'm all about death and rebirth and all this stuff, but there is a part of me that is very sensitive to that subject. And I will say, in regards to my own mortality, now that I am in a new environment that's really positive to me, sometimes I get this paranoia to where it's like, okay, things are a little too good to be true. Am I, about to cross that threshold? Like, could I potentially like this? Could this be the end at times? And that's just, my own personal thing. I haven't shared that with anyone, so all your listeners are getting the exclusive. But no, in terms of my own relationship with death, I would say that I understand that it's a natural part of life. It is a cycle. It is a beginning of a new cycle ultimately. But in terms of the nitty gritty, the reality of it, there is a part of me that definitely fears it just because I feel like, I have all these intentions to do so much more and to touch so much more people and to learn so much more. So I can't say that, I'm just so like, oh, I'm ready for it. Whatever happens, happens. No, that's not the truth. But I respect it. I respect death. I respect, the reason for it and the purpose for it and why God has it as a part of our life. But, I definitely have insecurities about it, vulnerabilities about it right now. That's for sure.
Yeah, thank you for sharing all of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, what is your current belief in life after death, if there is?
I believe in reincarnation, that's for sure. But I also believe that like depending on what you experience in this lifetime and if you've learned certain experience and the most high feels that you've learned from those experiences, you're either, up there in that other realm or in those other realms, learning from that perspective, or either helping people as spirit guides here in the physical realm here, or you reincarnate. So there's definitely different valleys and ebbs and flows that you experience post death. But in my belief, that's for sure. So, there isn't just one way, but I definitely feel there's certainly three particular different ways. And it isn't just, the end all be all, that's for sure.
I used to really fear death a lot. And I think that was partly rooted in the fact that I saw how much my father feared it. But then when I lost my father back in 2011.
Sorry.
Thank you. My relationship with death changed. Like I wasn't, like the fear of it completely dissipated. But I will say that as of recently, I too have been, the reality of my mother passing has been coming up for some reason. And that definitely hits a soft spot, just, yeah.
I can understand. I mean, I feel the same way because it's where you got your start. It's where you were incubated for 9 months, and it's what you know as a nurturing energy for you. Some people have that relationship, not all, but at least, based off of your experience, I could tell you get that from her. I definitely get that from my mother. I've definitely had a hard relationship with my mother over the years, but it's definitely different now as we both aged and we both grown. And definitely the thought of that ending, now that we're at such a good place, definitely irks me and definitely, shakes me quite a bit. So yeah, I could definitely understand.
Yeah. And I think that it's also partly due to the fact that my current relationship with my mom it also currently looks different than it used to. Like for most of my life, to be completely honest, we've always had a very strenuous relationship. And I would say as of very recently, like really, I think last year was like the year where that really shifted for us. Now that I am getting to experience my mother in this new way, I think that's probably why, that reflection, is starting to come up more than it has in the past. And I'm glad that you yourself are experiencing a closer relationship with your mother. Yeah, life is
a trip. Yeah,
it really is, right? Like, yeah. I'm still exploring what it is that I believe in, happens after death. But I do believe that, when you really look at everything as energy and you realize that energy itself doesn't necessarily die.
Yeah.
You see death differently, like I don't believe that when a loved one passes, they're completely absent.
Absolutely not.
To continue on kind of slightly on that topic, do you prioritize or hold space for communication with loved ones who have passed?
Absolutely. That's a big part of my hoodoo practice is ancestor veneration. I don't have, an altar at the moment just because I'm in transition of moving. But when I do, and I do have a lot more of a stable living situation, definitely leaving out offerings is my communication. I mean, I communicate with Isaac still. He didn't tell me about his connection to this, but I leave him offerings all the time. Anytime I do leave offerings, as well as my friend Chris, who passed away, my friend Marvin, who passed away, as well as all my relatives. I definitely maintain good level of communication when I can in terms of offerings to them, to those that have crossed over, that's for sure. And that's how, I'm able to have such confidence in what it is that I'm doing. Not always do I have confidence, but it definitely, by doing that, it definitely helps. That's for sure. So yeah, I definitely maintain communication with my relatives that have deceased as well as friends that have passed away. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
what part of your practice do you feel is the thing that keeps you the most centered or connected to spirit?
The daily gratitude psalm that I say every single day. Sometimes I forget, to be honest, because I'm human. But knowing that at least that I have that as my rock, as my anchor, it definitely helps me, keeps me in check, especially when I can't do, all the spiritual rigmarole and hullabaloo that, you might see other people doing in terms of magic. When I can't do those things, at least I have that to center me, that's for sure.
Yeah, yeah.
Gratitude is important.
It really is. It really is. And, I think a lot of people, when they think of gratitude, they think of it as a tool for manifestation.
Mm-hmm.
But
so much more than that.
The reason why I personally have such a, I guess, intimate relationship with gratitude is because it really is the thing that has helped me alchemize, a very difficult moment into a moment that didn't overpower me.
Mm-hmm.
Like the tower moment that I touched on with you that happened back around the same time that you had yours that you touched on. Gratitude, thinking of the things that I felt grateful for. And really, when you do it in that way, what you're essentially doing is counting your blessings. It just completely shifts your energy, and just becoming more conscious aware of the fact that what you're placing your attention on is what you're energizing.
Yeah.
Gratitude is that thing for me that just, I think also I can relate to you on that's the thing that really keeps me centered and connected to spirit. Absolutely. When I was going through my tower moment, and I've been reflecting on that actually recently, I remember consistently thinking how I felt so disconnected to spirit. Mm-hmm. I remember consistently thinking that wow, I really miss feeling connected to the universe. I miss that feeling of feeling very divine and awake, and having that void is a feeling that I'll never forget because I was so conscious of it at the time. Mm-hmm. And really, in my opinion, what that was is the fact that I was so disconnected to myself. I think essentially that's what it is,
Yeah, absolutely.
Your connection to spirit or to the Most High is really a reflection of your connection to yourself.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's a wonderful way to put it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah. What are, some of the life moments that you have recently been reflecting on?
I would say, my transition from California to the South and being okay with that, because I was always someone, I for years, especially during most of my 20s, I always had these dreams of working in film and working in television. And that was really what was keeping me in Los Angeles for years and years and years, even when, like I said, I was living in my car, living with friends that had no money and stuff like that. That was really the root of why I went through all those things. But the metamorphosis of where, my head is at and what it is I truly want and how I can still obtain those things from a different location, from a different place. I'd say my reflection on the fact that I've been able to outgrow the need of it happening the way that I want it and happening where I want it to happen. And my transition from California to the South, not necessarily kind of holding on or having that anchor or needing that in order to maintain what it is I want, the happiness that I want, and being okay with letting go. Like we said before, people who have issues with change, and tower moments, that's what those are. And that's what that was. whether it was the pandemic allowing me to, collect unemployment and move seamlessly, or whether it was before that, I had vacation with my job, vacation time off that I took, and I ended up going into the hospital, and my job told me that I couldn't take the vacation time because I was in the hospital the whole time. So then I was just like in this really negative space because I wanted to see my mother for Christmas so bad. But the fact that everything worked out in such a nice, seamless way anyway, and I was able to be with my mom for an entire year, including Christmas, and get paid for it, you know, the ability to understand that that's how things happen sometimes in life, and understand that it's not happening to you, it's happening for you. The ability to be able to see that, that's what I've been reflecting on the most, at least most recently, in terms
Yeah.
of actual life events. Yeah.
Right. So your move was recent.
Yeah. Yeah. March 2020, April 2020, to be exact. Yeah.
Okay. So 2020 was a year for you
Yeah.
too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. I really do feel like there were many divine changes for our own good,
Yeah.
that
Absolutely.
happened in
Yeah.
2020.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for
Thank you, Jocelyn,
this
for having me on.
conversation.
Thank you
Um,
for having it with me. Yes, absolutely.
is there anything that you feel called to say or didn't get to say? I want to hold space for that. If not, it's totally okay.
I'll just say to whoever's listening, I feel that the message that I have for you is comparison is the thief of joy. That's what's coming to me right now. Don't necessarily feel like just because you're at XYZ age, or you're XYZ weight, or XYZ height, or you have XYZ money, that you're inadequate or you're better than. Ultimately, your experience is solely yours and it belongs to you. That's the message that I have to share with whoever is listening right now. Understand that you are at your own pace, like I said at the beginning of the call, and know that, and be confident in that, and embrace your ancestors as best that you can, whoever your ancestors are. Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
I appreciate you,
Appreciate you as well.
and I look forward to sharing this.
Thank you.